I want to thank everyone who is joining us here for our webinar on technology and the church and the relationship between those things throughout history. Those of you who have been following us know that this year's theme has been emerging technology and its interface with Christian ministry. And this webinar is a bit of a warm up to that. Before I introduce my guests, my name's John Hilber. I am a professor of Old Testament studies here at McMaster. And I've asked to help us out here a friend and colleague, Derek Schuurman, who's a professor of computer science at Calvin University. And for some time now, he has been following closely the development of artificial intelligence and technology in general. And he has a keen interest in practical Christian ministry and discipleship. And so he's thought carefully about how those things interface. And he's pleased to join us this afternoon to give us, as I said, just sort of a big picture overview that I think you'll find helpful to contextualize what is behind where we're at these days. And so I go ahead now and turn it over to Dr. Schuurman, and we'll let him take it from there, and then we'll hope to have a good 10, 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of his presentation.
Thank you, John. It's a delight to be back in Canada, albeit virtually. Uh, I'm a Canadian citizen living in exile in West Michigan, and I'm always delighted when I get invitations to talk to folks back home. I raised my kids in Hamilton and am a graduate, a proud graduate of McMaster University, and in the engineering department, and so I'm really honored for the invitation. And as you mentioned, this is kind of setting the backdrop for sort of the story of technology. And the conference in May will focus more on AI, and then drill down even more into implications for the church. But this is kind of the sort of backstory a little bit, and about the sort of currents that sort of led us to our current moment, I would say.
Dr.
All right,
Schuurman.
yeah, I'm always afraid of immediately losing my competence in terms of what the audience thinks. You know, you're a computer scientist, and everyone assumes you should know how to run PowerPoint, and that's true. So I'm glad that that's working fine. All right, the title of the talk is Perspectives on Progress, Technological Visions and Illusions. And just really quickly about myself. As a young teenager, I'm dating myself now, but I grew up in the 1980s when the personal computer revolution was just taking off, and delighted in the possibilities of personal computers, and knew that it was going to become a part of my life in some shape or form. And my first computer is pictured here. It's a Timex Sinclair ZX81. And I actually have it I still have the keyboard, posted proudly on my bookshelf here. And it had 1 kilobyte of RAM. And then I splurged and bought a 16 kilobyte RAM pack for it, and just delighted in the possibility of personal computing. I had no clue where it was going, of course, but I knew that this was an exciting new development. And of course, if you look at the sort of progress of computer processors and semiconductor fabrication, starting with the original sort of first, computer on a chip, the Intel 4004 in 1973 or so, when I was, still very, very young, and then kind of progressing through the decades. And the thing to note on this chart is that the y-axis is exponential. So we're looking at exponential growth. And Moore's law states that the number of transistors on a silicon chip approximately doubles every 18 months. Now, it's not a law, it's an observation, really. but it sort of shows you the rapid progress, which has sort of fueled our more recent developments in AI and machine learning and so on. The little red dot on that chart represents the place that my little Sinclair ZX81 sat at the time, and so right at the beginning. But the whole idea of progress is one that I want to explore a little bit more. And oftentimes when we look at the eras, not just our current computing era, but we look at the eras over the ages, they're often named for the key technology of the time, right? There's the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Steam Age and so on. And we live now in the Information Age or the age of AI. And so each of these eras is often qualified by the sort of technological development of the time. And one way of understanding progress is that it is an assumption that there's a pattern of change that exists in the history of mankind, that it consists of irreversible changes in one direction only, and that direction is towards improvement. So if you look at the y-axis there, it's progress. Now, I don't know what the units of progress is, but there is this notion built into um, the idea of progress that it is increasing technological change and it's always moving forward. And we see that more recently in just the personal computer era. But if we go back even further, we see that that's been the case. And I have a photograph here, which I find kind of interesting. It's a photograph of a statue that was created for the 1930 something World Fair. And it's basically a robot that's pushing both a man and a woman forward into the future. You see that technology is somehow leading mankind forward, that it's technology that's nudging people rather than the other way around. And and so I think that this is a particular view of technology that we see and that a lot of people sort of assume. And of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. I think you can trace the story of technology and science more generally to the Enlightenment, of course. The Enlightenment story was one where, as people were increasingly uncovering all of the possibilities in creation, that they began to think, wow, look at what we can do. And then the sort of assumption became that through the pursuit of reason and the scientific method, humans will progress again, to create better societies and better people over time. And, it's basically, I would argue, a rival story to the biblical narrative, right? The biblical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, new creation, which was this notion of moving forward towards the new heavens and the new earth, where actually, people replaced that sort of coming of the kingdom that was built by God to a kingdom where they would build it on their own. The one book pictured there, The Heavenly City of the 18th century philosophers, has this quote that those natural philosophers demolished the holy city only to rebuild it with more up-to-date materials. That was sort of the thinking. And uh, and I think that this story goes back even further. And this is debatable. People have kind of sparred over this. But some people say that this modern idea, this Enlightenment story, actually goes back to views of Epicureanism, which have much more ancient roots. And here's a quote from Catherine Wilson, who's written on this topic. She said, "I see the Enlightenment not simply as a secularist movement, but is actually an Epicurean, a modern retrieval of an ancient philosophy, an ancient worldview with some modern twists and footnotes, right?" And the idea of Epicureanism is basically that, God is not present or he doesn't exist. And so it's sort of up to us to kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and the world is kind of made up of physical things that we have to manipulate. So that viewpoint has been kind of she argues, Catherine Wilson argues, has been sort of rebooted in the Enlightenment era. And of course, what we see is this philosophy of the Enlightenment becoming more and more mainstream as time goes on. And we see it well, here's a few snapshots of a few inventors and key technology milestones. You know, Nikola Tesla, of course, being a pioneer of electricity, you know, basically saw the development of electricity and made all kinds of bold claims. And here's a quote from one of his essays. He wrote, "We soon to have everywhere smoke annihilators, dust absorbers, ozonizers, sterilizers of water, air, food, and clothing, accident preventers on streets, elevated roads and subways. It will become next to impossible to contract disease germs or get hurt in the city." Uh, that would have been really handy during COVID, of course, but that was his prediction. And humanity, and he goes on, humanity will be united, wars will be made impossible, and peace will reign supreme. I mean, this is almost kind of biblical, or eschatological language, right? Of technology wiping away every tear and bringing peace on earth. So these are very large claims, and of course, the same thing with the telegraph. Telegraph, of course, was a tremendous achievement. A wonderful story about that is the Victorian Internet. It's kind of a novel about the development of the telegraph. And before the telegraph, of course, information could only flow as fast as a horse could gallop. And of course, the telegraph strung these communication lines across the ocean in the mid 19th century. And people began to make predictions like the following. Here's a quote: "It's impossible that old prejudices and hostilities should longer exist while such an instrument has been created for the exchange of thought between all." And people actually predicted that the telegraph would bring peace and an end to war, and that people would turn their muskets into candlesticks. There's all kinds of rhetoric that came with the birth of the telegraph. And you can see it in paintings and in fine art from the time. Here's a painting called American Progress. This is always an interesting exercise for my students. I have them kind of look at it and give me their thoughts. But you see a herald here who's stringing a telegraph wire and holding a book representing knowledge. And you see sort of light on the right-hand side and darkness on the left-hand side. And you see, she's bringing technology and scientific understanding and the Enlightenment, and the native folks are being dispersed in front of her, and we see behind her, ships and ports and trains and so on. So it's kind of a disturbing image, but it sort of gives you this sort of a hint of the ethos of the time, right? A technology being a herald that's bringing light. And this is a famous painting, Men of Progress. 19 inventors who basically altered the course of contemporary civilization. And you can see on there, basically a list of all kinds of, or images of, Samuel Morse and Samuel Colt, right, the inventor of the revolver, and Charles Goodyear, a whole bunch of the sort of the constellation of saints of progress are kind of shown there, and there's a painting in the background of Benjamin Franklin lovingly looking down on them. So you sort of see all of this attitude reflected also in the art of the day. And I wanted to include this. This is Walt Disney, this panorama from the Horizons ride. It almost looks like the painting American Progress, right? On the far left, you have darkness, you have, sort of ancient structures that are depicted there, and then you see the shining city on a hill, the New Jerusalem, if you will, brought about by technology. Walt Disney was a real futurist, a real optimistic person about progress. There's a book here titled Walt and the Promise of Progress City. Historian Michael Smith has said, Epcot, the Epcot Center, is more than a Tomorrowland on steroids. It functions as a missionary outpost dispensing a catechism, and that's a catechism of progress and how science and technology will lead us there. Maybe some of you have actually been on this ride, but there is the Carousel of Progress. That's one of the longest running shows in American history that you can go to at Walt Disney, and you basically see a family scene that's rotating through the past, the present, and the future, and you see the wonderful developments of technology, all to the tune of the song "There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow," and so on. So it sort of shows the philosophy that sort of undergirds this view of progress. And of course, when the internet came, we see similar claims, right? Nicholas Negroponte from the MIT Media Lab, when at the birth of the web, wrote, "A new generation is emerging from the digital landscape, free of the many old prejudices. Digital technology can be a natural force, drawing people into greater world harmony." I mean, these are big claims, of course. And then most recently, and this will be the subject of some of my talks in May, I'll do a deep dive on artificial intelligence. But here is a snapshot of an article called AI Will Save the World, right? And the author, Mark Andreessen, is one of the pioneers of the World Wide Web and a venture capitalist. And, and he makes these broad claims, with AI, every child will have a personal tutor and everyone will have a personal coach and mentor. Every scientist and leader will have an AI assistant. Productivity will accelerate. The creative arts will flower. Death rates will be reduced. War will become unnecessary. I mean, these are echoes of the other claims made at some of the other technologies I discussed earlier. So we see this sort of repeating kind of optimistic claims about science and progress and the technology of the day. Mark Andreessen is also the author of the Techno Optimist Manifesto, and I grabbed a few excerpts from that for you, and I'll quickly read them. Andreessen writes, technology is the glory of human ambition and achievement, the spearhead of progress and the realization of our potential. For hundreds of years, we properly glorified this until recently. I'm here to bring the good news. We can advance to a far superior way of living and being. We believe that there is no material problem, whether created by nature or by technology, that cannot be solved by technology. And basically, this is an expression of something that has been called technicism. So, technicism is a word for the trust in the progress of technology to solve all of our problems and to bring health and material prosperity. And I have a snapshot of a book there titled Infinite Progress. I got this image off the web. And the subtitle of the book you can't really see, but it's blown up here in the image. How the Internet and Technology Will End Ignorance, Disease, Poverty, Hunger, and War. Huge claims. Again, it sounds like an echo of the passage in Revelations when the new heavens and the new earth come. I like this quote from Neil Postman. He wrote, we believe nothing, if not that history is moving us towards some preordained paradise and that technology is the force behind that movement. And I think Christians need to call this for what it is. It's idolatry, right? And it's a modern kind of Tower of Babel story, right? The Tower of Babel already, right, tells us about how people were trying to build their own bridge between heaven and earth. John's an Old Testament scholar, so I will defer to him on the specifics there. But we read in that passage in Genesis 11 about how people were trying to make a name for themselves. How they were trying not to be scattered, right? When God told them to fill the earth, and also about how they tried to build their own bridge between heaven and earth, right? And by their own wits, using technology, using bricks and mortar, a new technology that they had developed. So these themes are not new, and I think AI is just a more recent wave of a kind of ideology that we see in a lot of these other eras as well. And in fact, I'm not going to say a lot about this, but those of you who maybe are familiar with Ray Kurzweil, he's a director of engineering at Google, a former MIT Media Lab personality, inventor, and quite a clever guy. But he has written about how one day, and here's a quote, actually, there won't be mortality by the end of the 21st century. Not if you take advantage of the 21st century's brain porting technology. We will be software, not hardware. And actually, I need to update that. That is the title of his famous book, The Singularity is Near, the singularity being the time when, computers overtake humans. And he has a new book out called The Singularity is Nearer, and where he updates a lot of his arguments. And so that's Ray Kurzweil. And of course, he's on a diet of vitamins and injections and other things to keep his body healthy so that he will be able to survive to the point where we will have the technology to do that brain porting um, um, procedure that he talks about. So technology will even solve the problem of death. According to these writers. It makes me think actually of Psalm 115, right? Psalm 115 talks about idols and how those who make them will become like them. And I think if you download your brain into a computer, you become a computer. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a philosophy and ideology that sees technology as always moving forward, um, progress being related to technology, and the notion of history always moving forward more generally is not completely new. St. Augustine had this sort of view of history, of course, with a different telos. And modern philosophers like Hegel and Marx saw history as moving forward. Um, and of course, this was not how the ancients saw things. Traditionally, the ancients saw history as kind of a cyclical thing, that civilizations and eras sort of ebbed and flowed. The early Greeks had a concept called anacyclosis, this idea of different forms of governments sort of coming and going, aristocracies and oligarchies and democracies and tyrannies. And the Chinese, the Romans, and the Aztecs all had views of history that saw them as continuous cycles. And of course, turning back to art, I'll show you a sequence of paintings that maybe you're familiar with. The Course of Empire is a sequence of 5 paintings. The first painting is called The Savage State, and it's sort of this pristine sort of early um, creation almost, if you will. And then a pastoral state as people begin to develop agriculture and so on. And then a state of the consummation of empire, it's called, where people build technology and architecture and cities and so on. And then the state called the state of destruction, and you can see kind of an apocalyptic view there as the city and its infrastructure and its societal structures are destroyed. And then finally, a state called desolation, which kind of restores the sort of surrounding land and the area to an early state, and then the cycle, of course, continues. So that these are just a depiction of these sort of cycles of history. Now, that's not the only view. There are also views about how progress and history sort of reach a kind of endpoint, right? Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, right? And then the book by John Horgan, The End of Science. Um, Teilhard de Chardin has talked about the omega point, this point in history where we sort of reach a certain point beyond which things don't progress any further. Francis Fukuyama talks about the endpoint of humanity being ideological evolution. The universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. And so this is sort of a different view of history that we're sort of moving to sort of a stable plateau at some point. And more discouragingly, there is the view of a progress trap, and more talk about this, of course, through the 20th century already, right? With the development of nuclear power, you know, um, the uh, the Silent Spring kind of alerted a lot of people to DDT and the environmental problems that we have, and more recently, climate change. Many 20th century thinkers rejected the notion of progress, after the two world wars, the Holocaust, and so on. And you can see a photograph there of the climate clock, which is sort of counting down to a environmental disaster. A book there that talks about the collapse of complex societies. There are even people in the world of AI talking about risks of risk of extinction, existential extinction. And then, of course, there's a theory by philosopher Nick Bostrom about the vulnerable world hypothesis, where, at some point someone develops a technology that is so destructive and which is so easy for people to make in their basement using whatever technology of the day that we will reach a point where eventually we will be destroyed. And this is called a progress trap, right? Progress provides benefits in the short term, right? We see sort of this moving forward, but then ultimately leads to unsustainability and disaster, right? And sometimes this has been referred to as a Malthusian catastrophe early on. There was Thomas Malthus talked about the scenario where population growth outgrows, agriculture, and then we have a huge famine and war. But more broadly, the progress trap is that we hit up against some creational limit, and then things get destroyed. And I like to think of, Fantasia, that Disney movie, where Mickey is the sorcerer's apprentice, and that he is, using magic, that he is not completely familiar with, to unleash these brooms to kind of do his chores for him, but then he loses control, right? And the brooms turn on him. and wreak havoc. And a lot of people have compared technology to magic, right? Trying to control the natural world. And of course, a lot of people have made the point that this usually leads to a kind of consequences and sometimes even disastrous consequences. And then, even more depressingly, and any one of these things could be a talk on their own, there is a new emergence of something called Anthropocene anti-humanism, right? This idea that, humankind is going to go extinct. And some people would say that that's a good thing. So here's some quotes, right? Here's a book, The A-Human Manifesto by Patricia McCormick. It's a call to end to the human both conceptually as exceptionalized and actually as a species. Humans are identified as a parasitic, detrimental species. And listen to this. Here's a quote. The death of the human species is the most life-affirming event that could liberate the natural world from oppression. Um, yeah, pretty far out views. And of course, if we look in sci-fi and the arts, right, there's no end to sci-fi movies that have that Frankenstein narrative of how, we build technology and then it turns on us, right? The Terminator series being a classic example. I like the Wall-E movie because there's a glimmer of hope at the end, right? But we see a dystopian world and people kind of socked away on ships, sitting in lazy boy chairs and sipping Slurpees and looking at screens. And then at the end of the movie, right, there's this fledgling plant that they bring back to this barren planet, and people try to, become people again. And I thought I would share this painting because it's Hamilton. This is a picture of a atomic bomb going off in Hamilton. It was painted by William Kurlick, and it's called Glory to Man in the Highest. This is the nemesis. And basically it's a fictional depiction of the destruction of Hamilton by a nuclear bomb, right? And then all around the border, you can't really see this, but around the border of this painting is a television schedule, and then the quote at the top, right? A good science fiction story should be able to predict not just the automobile, but the traffic jam. And I think a lot of artists do that for us. They think about, future technologies, but also thinking about what the consequences might be if we make poor decisions. All right, so four theories of process, the sort of linear sort of increase, forever into the future, the sort of cyclic view of progress, the sort of end of history sort of progress, and then the sort of depressing apocalyptic sort of view of progress. And so the question is, as Christians informed by the biblical story, what ought we to think about this, right? And also in terms of how it relates to technology. And I have to keep an eye on the time here, but I'll quickly share some ideas. So Alistair McIntyre, famous ethics philosopher, once said, "We can't really answer the question what we ought to do until we answer the prior question, of what story are we a part?" And so the question is, what does the biblical story tell us about history, about who we are, about what the problem with the world is, what the remedy is, and what can we learn from that in terms of how we look at history and technology and progress? And one way to think about, the biblical story is to think about the basic themes of creation, fall, redemption, and new creation, and look at the sweep of that biblical story, and then use that as a pair of lenses for thinking about technology and about progress. And my premise is that the Christian story will lead to much more responsible technology than the Enlightenment story or any of these other stories. And the question is, how does the Bible, which was written in the Bronze and Iron Age, have anything to say to the age of AI? So, just very quickly, with the time that we have, creation tells us that God made a world that was good. And technology is part of that latent potential in creation that we are called to unfold responsibly. And we see that already in the creational mandate in Genesis 1. We see in Genesis 2 the call to tend and to keep. We see actually in Genesis 2, verse 12, a reference to, that the land has gold and it has onyx and other materials, raw materials, which I think imply that we're called to unfold and discover and invent. But the fall, of course, somewhere near the beginning of the biblical story, the human family fell into sin, and that has perverted and distorted also our technological activities. Romans 8 talks about how the whole creation is groaning. And so our technologies, and I would say even, more broadly, our view of technology and our understanding of the world is always intertwined with the effects of sin and idolatry. But of course, in the fullness of time, Jesus Christ came, and I love this piece from Colossians, and I'll flash on the screen here the McMaster shield, which I'm sure many of you have seen, right? With the Greek words from Colossians 1 emblazoned across the top. Tapanta, right? For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And what's wonderful about that passage in particular is just the repeated phrase, all things, right? All things. The Greek being tapanta, and maybe there's a MacDiv theologian who can correct me if that pronunciation is wrong. But this idea that, redemption is comprehensive, that God cares about all things, that it's not just about me and Jesus, but also about this cosmic notion of redemption and salvation. One of the theology profs here at Calvin University is famous for saying, nothing matters but the kingdom. But because of the kingdom, everything matters, right? It's this comprehensive view of redemption. And I like that vision as an engineer and a computer scientist to think about also our technical work as being something that requires redemption and that God cares about. And I think having a proper view of eschatology also shapes how we see what we're doing now, today, also in the world of technology, right? A biblical vision of the future of a new heaven and a new earth, right? The notion that the biblical narrative moves from a garden to a city, um, right? But we're told that that city is not one that we build ourselves, right? Its builder and architect is God. We don't build it ourselves. God does not subcontract the New Jerusalem to us, right? And we read it comes down out of heaven to earth. And so I think we need to put technology in its place in terms of its role in our eschatological visions. God cares about it and he's redeeming all things, but technology does not set the timetable or is not the essence of the renewal of the earth. I like this view from Micah 4, verse 3, this notion of people beating their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. This idea that technology that's misdirected, intertwined with sin, being redirected towards, the purposes for which God originally intended us to do, right? To take care of the earth, to cultivate it. And I think all kinds of technologies can be repurposed and redirected into obedient ways of serving God and our neighbor. And I like this verse too. There's this one verse in Revelation 21 that Richard Mouw has expanded on in his little book, when the kings come marching in, right? Revelations 21, 24 to 26 talks about how the glory and honor of the nations will be brought into this new Jerusalem. And I like to think that that includes, a lot of cultural artifacts and things that may also include technology, but technology that will be redeemed and purified, free of sin, but that it will appear, some of some of the glory and honor of the nations and our cultural artifacts will find their way into the new heavens and the new earth. There's a fascinating verse from Zechariah as well that reads, on that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord Almighty. And you think about that phrase was sort of emblazoned on different parts of the priest's outfit, but now it's going to be on every single object, these ordinary everyday objects, bells and pots, And if one wants to extend this to think about holy to the Lord being emblazoned on technological artifacts as well, on laptops and computers and all kinds of things. Isaiah 60 is referenced in Mao's book too as being an image of Zion, and in that new sort of Jerusalem we have flocks and camels and precious metals and lumber, and then also the ships of Tarshish appear. The ships of Tarshish are there, and Richard Mao says, well, these are symbols of pagan commercial power that are repurposed for service to the Lord. So I often joke with my students, will there be computers in heaven? And a lot of them will say no. And then I'll say, well, what about harps? Will there be harps in heaven? Oh yeah, yeah, there'll be harps. But of course, a harp is a technological artifact as well. And I think that there will be, technology in some shape or form. This is highly speculative, of course, but that we will find technology as well as part of all things, as part of the latent potential in creation, free of sin, as well in the new heavens and the new earth. And I find that as an engineer and a computer scientist, an exciting thing to think about. So, some implications of a biblical worldview, just really, really quickly. Technology is neither the savior nor the villain. Redemption comes from Christ, not from AI or from um, electricity or from the internet or wherever you want to look to it for that. Technology is also not the villain, right? The issue is sin, not a particular technology. The heavenly city comes down from God, not from our own efforts. God does not subcontract the New Jerusalem to us. And as engineers, we should not think that our work is somehow privileged as sort of building the foundations of that New Jerusalem. St. Augustine talked about how history has meaning and direction, but that it's guided by divine providence, not by our own efforts. Right? Here's a quote from St. Augustine. Daily make progress, he says, seeking to acquire not an earthly kingdom, but the kingdom of heaven, not a temporal, but an eternal inheritance. And I think, until the new heavens and the new earth come, we're called to make some imperfect models of the perfect world to come, including technological models. And that's a quote from Lewis Smedes. And what does that look like? It looks like putting technology in service of God and neighbor and creation, right? Being attentive to norms. And a future talk, I'll talk more about norms for AI. Not confusing the cultural mandate with a technological mandate, right? And focusing on responsibility versus a technological imperative where we just move forward and break things. So I think the biblical worldview and story is a corrective to some of the modern views of progress. There's still a place for technology and an obedient, responsible approach to it, but to put it in its place. And so I'll just close with a quote from contemporary testimony. Our world belongs to God, where it reads, our hope for a new creation is not tied to what humans can do, for we believe that one day every challenge to God's rule will be crushed, his kingdom will fully come, and the Lord will rule. Come, Lord Jesus, come. And I love this quote, of course, from Revelations 21, right? The vision of a new heaven and a new earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. These are incredibly um, wonderful words of comfort. These are words we read when I lost my own wife to cancer a little over a year ago. A vision of hope for a future that comes from the hand of God. And I thought I would leave you with this wonderful painting by James Yunnecht, calling "Make Everything New," titled "Make All Things New." And you can see there an image of all things, right? You see an image that portraying Christ in the center there. But you see that, he is restoring all things, including guitars and plants and bicycles and houses. And I think there's a barbecue and a lawnmower in there somewhere. But this comprehensive view of these things being made new through Christ in the new heaven and the new earth, and that it includes indeed all things. So that sort of sets a frame. And in my talks in May, I want to do a more specific focus on AI specifically, and then looking at AI and implications for the church, given this larger backdrop of modern views on progress and technology. So John, that's I'll park it there, and if you'd like to have a time for questions or whatever, I'll hand it over to you to moderate that. So thank you.
Derek, thanks very much. I love people whose expertise does what I can't do in that area and get these big, kind of big picture overviews because I'm convinced, even as I am, as a biblical scholar, context is everything, I tell my students. And I think that's true for whether we're talking about our families or we're talking about history or we're talking about concepts like technology and where everything all fits together. So I think that's extremely helpful, and I thank you for that. What I'd like to do, we have about 15 minutes, and so I'd like to turn this over to Q&A. And I think there's enough people here that we can't sort of unmute. So maybe, yeah, I think maybe I can moderate that. If you have a question, uh, you can. I was going to take them over the chat, but it looks like they're already coming through. Okay, I'll take some chat here. Oh, just thank yous from people. You can ask a question either in chat or if you put your hand up, I'll call on you and we'll direct it to Derek. I know I have some questions, but I'll hold those off and give you. Yeah, I'm sorry. DHIXC.
My name is Dwayne Hicks.
Wayne.
That's
Okay,
the
go
start
ahead.
of my email. I am intrigued, obviously, and pleased with the presentation. I'm wondering if Professor Schuurman has had a chance to discuss some of the work of Reinhold Niebuhr with his colleagues at Calvin. Niebuhr, of course, writing 75, 80 years ago, was able to point out the inconsistencies of our understanding of history in The Irony of History and other books that he wrote. And his point was that many Christians make two mistakes, one or the other. One is that they simply deny that there has been progress and kind of retreat to a way of denying that anything good has come out of the Enlightenment and modern world. And then the other is that they are unable to separate the technological progress, cultural progress, if you will, from moral progress and from spiritual progress. And I mean, he makes these points. He warns us of this back when he was writing in the 1940s and 50s. And I found him a good resource for deciding the where it is one and where it is the other. So that's just a comment, not so much.
What was the name of the author again and the question for?
Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr.
The theologian.
Oh, yeah, Niebuhr.
Christ and Culture. You're talking about Christ and Culture, his book?
No, that's H.R. Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr was the one who wrote the Gifford lectures on the nature and destiny of man and the irony of American history and that sort of thing, and faith and history. And he has been he's been really a good preliminary warning about the two extremes to which we can go and miss the impact.
Thanks so much. Derek, do you have any thoughts or?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think a biblical worldview adds a bit of a corrective to that, right? If you see technology as part of the latent potential in creation, you don't reject these things sort of out of hand. But the notion that they're intertwined with the effects of sin means that we're not going to look to them for salvation, that we're called to be agents of reconciliation, Second Corinthians 5, which requires sort of ethical and moral kind of formation, becoming more like Christ, and seeing the importance of that in terms of our progress, right? There actually is a one passage in the Bible which I'm going to misquote, but somehow that you should do all you can to love and care for each other so that you may speed the day of Christ's coming, which you could interpret to being, maybe the way to bring about the new heavens, the new earth is just to love each other more and spread the gospel and so on. It doesn't seem to have a technological timetable, but we are called to become more like Christ. I mean, that is our calling. And in fact, the Colossians 1 verse that I quoted, you look at the verse immediately before that and immediately after that, is about personal transformation, about personally being redeemed and transformed. So I think you're right. There are these two errors we can have. We can kind of be otherworldly, or we can ignore sort of the calling that we need to have to engage and to also become the kind of people that God has called us to be.
Derek, there's a question came in on chat, and I know this is going to start to venture into what you'll be talking about in May as well. I know also my colleague Kelvin Mutter is going to be addressing this at a parallel session in May, but it's an important one.
Mhm.
As AI overtakes, well, AI has overtaken already humans in many different, sort of capacity
Domains. Yeah.
domains or whatever. Um, what aspects do you think there are that are completely impossible that AI will never be able to surpass the human mind slash soul, whatever?
Yeah, I think there's an ontological difference between a machine and a person. And I think what we need to recover is a Christian anthropology. Or this is where we need help from theologians and Christian philosophers. What is a person? And I think that a lot of secular technicists, see only the material world. This is something that was reflected on by Charles Taylor, right? This idea of a secular age, when technology becomes the means to experience a kind of transcendence rather than through God, and a society that sees only sort of natural things. So if you think that there is nothing more than the physical world, then we are machines, and just biological machines running on wetware instead of hardware. And so there's no ontological difference between a computer and a person, and we just have to crack the code of what is the software that's running under the hood. And this idea of Ray Kurzweil to download our brains into a computer presupposes that, right? There is the presupposition that's behind that, and yeah, it assumes that if you can completely simulate the electrochemical reactions in the brain, you can accurately reproduce a person inside of a machine. So it's an anthropological one. I mean, a computer and an AI system is a big calculator. And it turns out that our creation has a huge numerical aspect to it, but that things in creation, like people and and justice and faith, cannot be reduced to numerical computations. And so that it's a highly reductionistic philosophy. But yeah, if you start with certain presuppositions, then you move into that direction. And often I find in discourse that those presuppositions are never explicitly stated, but there is this assumption, right? So yeah, as a Christian who believes in a biblical anthropology, I think humans are distinct from machines. People are people and machines are machines. I mean, we even see in the creation story how Adam was made out of the dust of the earth, but also required the breath of the spirit. We see that in the vision of Ezekiel as well, with the dry bones, that, there's the flesh, but then it also requires the breath of the spirit. I think that we are ontologically very different. And, but, I think machines capture a very powerful aspect of understanding creation, and they can be very, very helpful tools in that. But I've written elsewhere about why it's problematic to build machines that mimic humans. Because I think you're creating ontological confusion. That's sort of the term that I sort of picked for that. You're sort of promoting this confusion between people and machines. And I'll be talking about this in May as well. I think there's a lot of temptation in churches to look at virtual pastors and virtual apologists and, a lot of people who are really good at technology, who are keen to help the church, but are starting with presuppositions that sort of direct the technology in ways that I think are actually not helpful. But I'll save some of that for May. So I'm just skimming the surface here, but that's some thoughts related to that question.
Thank you. Gene, you have a question, Gene Haas. You have
Nope,
to unmute,
you're
sir.
muted, Gene. Gene's a former colleague of mine from Redeemer, so now I'm a little nervous about what he's going to
Oh,
say.
Uh-oh.
no, no, I'm not trying to give you a gotcha question at all, Derek. Maybe it's too early to ask this question, and maybe you're the guy who's going to do this, but I'm just finishing reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious
Oh,
Generation.
anxious generation, yeah.
Yeah, the impact of cell phones on especially young people. But I'm wondering if I mean, you listed a number of books that were very optimistic about this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's people out there who present it all as negative, negative, negative. But are you aware of anything that's written? Maybe you're going to write this that sort of uh, affirms its goodness, but it mentions some of the dangers with AI.
Yeah, I actually
Would
have a
you
book
offer?
right here on the floor, um, which I mean, I would quibble about a few things here, but here's one example of a book that I've endorsed that just came out called AI Shepherds and Electric Sheep
Oh,
by Callahan and Hoffman. It's a Baker book, I think, or I think it's Baker Press. And
hmm,
I've endorsed it and I read it, and it's actually specifically for pastors and educators. And I think it takes that kind of balanced approach. There's so many books about 12 ways your phone is destroying you and, all this kind of stuff, which I think denies the creational goodness. Then on the other hand,
good.
there's sort of Christian transhumanists and others who have this overly optimistic about technology to bring about salvation, or being the road to, a new heaven and a new earth almost. Um, and um, and of course there's the Silicon Valley prophets who are telling us that AI will save the world. So I think the
Hmm.
biblical story gives us that balance. And yeah, I think we need more books that strike that balance. And affirming the creational goodness of these possibilities. And as a scientist, as a computer scientist and engineer, you know, I like to think that my discipline is not just rooted in the fall. The question is, how then shall we engineer? That's the bigger question. And
Yeah.
I'm careful. Maybe I should watch out how I say this, but they didn't talk a lot about this in my McMaster engineering education. But I think as Christians, we've got an opportunity, to kind of frame a responsible vision for this. Yeah.
Just to follow, are those computer science people? Are they ethicists? Who are the authors?
Uh, I think religious and theological studies, Sean O'Callahan, and then Paul Hoffman is a pastor and a Conwell. They're both look like theologians.
Okay.
So, but they're speaking, yeah. But yeah, we need computer scientists to be part of this too. And I'm on the cusp of trying to gather a group of people to write about this because I think that it is
Hmm.
intrinsically an interdisciplinary thing that needs to be tackled. Heaven help us if
The,
it's computer scientists who make the decisions about how we then shall live. And I think theologians don't have just simply the knowledge of the domain. And
right.
but we need each other. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek. I have to leave
Yeah.
now because I have a call at 1, but thank you so
Okay.
much for this presentation.
Good to see
So
you, Gene.
maybe you're the guy who's got to be the catalyst for writing this
Ooh,
book with all these
I don't
different.
know. I would
You
celebrate
might
it
be.
if it came. So yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gene.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more question that anybody might have. If not, I have a question that I'd like to ask. Uh, I'm curious, Derek. You've thought a lot about history of technology and the interface with Christendom, and I'll say Christendom to broaden it out even beyond people who are properly speaking in the church, capital
Hmm.
C. What kinds of reactions in the past has the church had to, whether it's printing press, gunpowder, steam, name the major thing, and what might we learn from past mistakes or even positive embracing of technology? Like, I mean, the printing press would be an obvious example of a positive embrace. It's been
Yeah.
tremendous.
Yeah, the Bible being one of the first books, published on the printing press and how it's, spurred the Protestant Reformation. Um, but yeah, over time you see this. I mean, getting back to, um, I mistakenly thought the one gentleman was talking about um, Christ and Culture, Niebuhr's book. But these different approaches to culture of Christ against culture and transforming culture and enthusiastically embracing culture. I mean, I'm using different terms for it, but you see these as well over history and then also now with AI. Different postures towards it, and there's different streams of Christian thought that have taken different tacks on this. Um, the transformationalists, out of the Reformed tradition, I think have one of the things they have to be careful is that they don't become too optimistic about our ability to transform things. I think those in sort of Anabaptist traditions have had a more skeptical view of the world, and I think again, it's going back to this biblical story about recognizing the goodness of the latent potential and the fact that it's always intertwined with sin. It gives us, I think, a really good starting point for this. But yeah, that would be an interesting thing to write about, just history over time, and technologies and how the church responded to it. I know, when one is talking about, lethal autonomous weapons, that when the crossbow was invented, there were Christians who criticized it as an unethical technology that someone from behind a tree could shoot a knight down at 100 yards and without even being able to look in their eyeballs, right? And when we think about drone technology, about dropping bombs from a distance, these sort of ethical questions about what a just war ought to look like. And I think over time too, Christians have been at various times skeptical or perhaps too not discerning enough about embracing certain technologies. I think one of the most helpful things to realize is that technology we shape. It's the words of Marshall McLuhan, right, or the summary of Marshall McLuhan, that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. So technology is never a neutral instrument that we just sort of insert into our lives and use it. It always amplifies some things, and it always makes certain other things more difficult. And uh, and so I think when we talk about technology in worship and technology in the church, we have to always sort of see that it's not neutral, right? It's value laden, that it changes things. And so when we think about AI, and when we look backwards at technologies that we've adopted in the church in the past, sort of thinking about, what we gained and what we lost, and being discerning about that. I just had a talk with my students in the last week about technology in church, lights and stages, and one of my students has just yesterday I was talking to her. She has a smoke machine in her church. So there's no offense to people who have smoke machines in their churches. But I said, what does the technology of a smoke machine do to a worship service? And what is its purpose? And what kind of analyzing technology in worship and how it shapes the worship experience and so on. Even thinking about lights and sound, when you have a band up front on a stage that's overpowering, the congregation, when they're trying to sing, what does that say about what worship is? What are the liturgies of the rock concert versus the worship service, and how does technology play a part in setting the stage for that? Um, I think I got a meandering response to your question, but
No, thank you.
yeah.
Yeah. Let, if you can hang on with me 1 minute, folks.
Yes.
Two things. One, and sir, I forgot your name already. Was it Daryl? He has written a book. DHIXP is his email. Anyway, if you want to check the title, it's over there in the chat
Oh,
column for anybody who's interested. Let me just do a little promo myself here for our um,
Excuse me, Dr. Hilber, I only sent that note to you.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was I didn't
I
okay.
didn't want to feel like I was promoting myself.
Oh,
So I
well,
sent it
that's
to
all
you.
right. I'm happy to direct people to that.
Sure.
Folks, this is a primer really for our May 8th symposium, which will devote a day to those topics. I've asked Derek he's going to do 2 plenary sessions for us at the symposium. Also, we're going to have Dr. Jeff Harden, who's a professor of integrative biology from University of Wisconsin-Madison, an expert on embryology. He's going to take us from the sort of the digital technology side to the biological technology side of things, and how emerging technologies in biology will challenge us and really put us on our toes for thinking about things ethically. There'll be 10 parallel sessions as well on various topics, all of which I've asked contributors to be relevant to Christian ministry. And so I hope that you'll find those stimulating and not just, I'm all for high-level intellectual engagement, but we want to press beyond that, and I think these folks will. So registration is available already at the website, McMaster Divinity, and I hope that you give serious thought to this and can join us. Thank you all for your time. I thank especially Professor Schuurman and look forward to hearing more from him on May 8th. So without further ado, I'll bid you all farewell and to have a good day.